Hold on, we're gonna go live 1 second and mute yourselves in the meantime, please.
Okay.
Tell me when, Karen. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Glad to have you here in this chaotic moment in global history. It's a pleasure to be with you today to focus on something other than counting votes. This is the second session of our Policing Black Power from Watts to Detroit series. Today, the theme is organizing against police repression, and we're lucky to have three wonderful guest speakers. We're going to start with Michael Stouch, who's a professor of history at University of Toledo. And then we're going to hear from my former fearless leader, Dr. Melba Joyce Boyd, acclaimed poet, filmmaker, and shit talker extraordinaire as well. And finally, we'll have Gregory Hicks, a graduate of Wayne State University with his PhD, and also somebody that was involved in the Black Student United Front, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and has been engaged in local politics for decades, particularly over issues of reform and including reforming police department. So welcome you today. Before I continue, I'm going to turn it over in a second to my stalwart web engineer, Carolyn Baker, who's right across from me. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that this event is being sponsored by the Semester in Detroit program, led by the wonderful and bearded Craig Register, as well as the General Baker Institute, where I'm sitting right now, off of Livernois, and Wayne State University's Department of African American Studies. And I want to give you a little bit of a chance to learn how you could donate, particularly to the General Baker Institute. So I'm going to bring Carolyn on now to talk a little bit about that. Not only that, but also to give you a bit of an update. She was down, what is it, TCF? At TCF Bank. The irony about this, for those of you that live in the city, they decided not to call Cobo Hall, because Mayor Cobo was a clear racist, right? And he also facilitated a lot of racist development in the city. And so what did they decide to do? They changed the name after a bank, which then practiced the similar racist loan lending practices that further segregated the metropolitan area. Neither here nor there. Now I'll hand it over to Carolyn Baker and mute myself.
So he has to turn his volume down.
Gotcha.
So, sorry, I'm multitasking. I'm running the YouTube and letting people in. Everyone can hear me in here, right? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Cool. So I want to thank everyone for joining. I want to thank the speakers. I want to thank Semester in Detroit. I'm with the General Baker Institute. We are built off of 4 pillars. Our 4 pillars are political popular education, projects of survival, arts and culture, and internationalism. We are also working on an oral history project that deals with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, getting them to tell their story instead of folks telling their story for them, which is rarely seen, so we're still working on that, and I want to thank everyone. So I want to also ask everyone if you can follow us on social media, General Baker Institute. You can go to our website, which is generalbakerinstitute.com, and get more information about us there. Then this is being live streamed on the YouTube page, General Baker Institute YouTube page. So go there, you can share it, and you can come back and watch it there. So please share, and we're also on Instagram. Yeah, I was down at TCF. I was down at New Center where there was a rally put on by a lot of grassroots organizations and some unions. When I say some, maybe 2 or 3 unions, which is sad when you're looking at Michigan. And so anyway, and I'm not sure how much of their union membership was actually there. So you might have 2 or 3 representatives from 2 or 3 unions who are actually down there. And so I also went down to TCF because I guess some supporters of Trump were down there trying to stop the count, trying to bust into the TCF. And so I was down there and got to witness that, and there were counter protesters trying to have them count every vote. So you just basically had a shouting match between the two groups. You had the police on the outskirts, not breaking it up. There was also some peacekeepers who were trying to stay in between, but the police were not trying to be the police keepers at all. They were on the outskirts waiting for something to jump off. And so, that's, I left it down there like, because I had to get back here, but that's what was taking place while I was down there. A lot of obscenities screamed back and forth between the two groups. But yeah, so I'm gonna pass it back over.
All right, so let me get started by kind of recapping. Last week we had a series of speakers and we talked about kind of the Watts Rebellion, as well as kind of like police repression in Detroit during the 1960s, particularly surrounding the Kercheval mini riot, as it was referred to back then, and by certain historians, as well as kind of like just general kind of the big four and police repression on the streets, particularly in the inner city in the early 60s. And one of the things that, one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of frame the panel like that is because Max, who spoke with us last week, really talked about kind of the impact of the Watts Rebellion on kind of the militarization of the police, one, but on the second level, he looked at it as one of these moments in which police, through their activities, cause a rebellion, but in the wake of that rebellion, they kind of mobilize their forces and their public relations kind of apparatus to claim justification for the need for greater and greater resources and to become even more militarized, right? And so this week, we're really looking at the 70s, and this is coming in the wake of the Detroit Rebellion, and we see a similar phenomenon, right? In the immediate aftermath of the Kavanaugh administration, but in the immediate aftermath of the rebellion in particular, and kind of the ramping up of law and order policing and kind of all these disparate units that are being formed to kind of further repress activism, but the Black population, the poor population, the working class population more broadly. So I thought, who would be better to talk about that than Michael, who's writing a book currently about policing in Detroit from, does it begin? It begins in the late 60s, Mike, right? From the late 60s until the 90s, right? Really from this period of stress to kind of Malice Green. And I'd be remiss not to mention that, again, the anniversary of Malice Green's murder is tomorrow, I believe. So without further ado, I'll give you Michael Stouch.
Well, thanks a lot, David, and also Craig and everyone else for organizing this. Carolyn, too, for being the web guru here. I appreciate it, and I'm really excited to be here. Can everyone hear me? Good. I think I'm going to share my screen so that I can share a bunch of slides, and that'll just help me walk you through it. I'm not planning on doing anything super formal, but I'm gonna kind of start in the present and then move backward, starting in 67, and kind of bring us from 67 back into the present. And that's kind of the plan for my comments today. So, and I'll be brief. Okay, I'm having I have to allow Zoom to access my screen. I hope this doesn't take too long. Okay. Do you have it or no?
Can't see it.
Can't see it. I don't know if I'll be able to do it because I have to. It looks like I might have to quit Zoom to do it. Okay. Can I share it with you, David?
Sure.
Let me do that real quick. Sorry about that. So I just shared it with you through Gmail.
Okay. Let's see here. Will you give me permission, Carol? Okay. Got it.
and I will try to coordinate and just kind of like let you know when to move forward, I suppose.
Okay, give me 1 sec.
Yeah.
Mm,
While we're getting that started, I just sort of I see it looks like they called Michigan for Biden, and from my understanding, that seems like it may be that the Democratic Party is going to win this election. I don't want to be too premature about that, but that was my understanding, was that Biden and Harris needed 2 states, and so I've prepared these comments in light of, I was thinking that they would probably win, so it makes it a little bit more pertinent that they seem on that road. But I also want to kind of, that forms a backdrop for those comments, because in some ways they represent the vanguard, if you like, of community policing. And I want to, in my comments today, kind of contrast that approach to the program of reform that's emerged in the last several months since George Floyd's death, which we could characterize as either not community policing, excuse me, defunding the police, or abolition. And so I wanted to kind of begin by putting these 2 facts in juxtaposition. One, police have killed at least 416 people since George Floyd's death, May 25th. And then 2, community policing, go ahead, David, has been federal policy since 1994. So it's really within the set of reforms that we associate with community policing that contemporary policing functions, right? The next slide mentions that following the Ferguson uprising, President Obama's task force on 21st century policing restated the set of reforms associated with community policing. And meanwhile, just recently, go ahead, the US Conference of Mayors and the Democratic Party's Justice and Policing Act, which was named after George Floyd, they also restated those reforms. Go ahead. And so again, at the head of the Democratic Party ticket in 2020 are the people who are to some extent responsible for this community policing. In particular, Biden, who wrote the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act that was passed in 1994 and gave made community policing federal policy by empowering the community, the Office of Community Oriented Policing Services, to hand out money to local police departments to implement reforms along the lines of community policing. So since 1994, that office has given $14 billion worth of funding to local police departments around the country. And some of these reforms that I've been mentioning here include more cops on the beat, so police will walk the beat in their neighborhoods, more effective training and the skills needed to interact with members of the community, and stuff about procedural reforms as well, so that when police are interacting with people during stops, they're sort of politer and have a sense of racial bias and how their own biases will affect that interaction. And another one is a commitment to diversity in hiring policies and that kind of thing. So they want to bring more women, people of color that are representative of the communities that police when they police, and those kinds of things. So those are some of the reforms that we associate with community policing, and we have done for at least since 1994. But in my brief remarks here, I wanted to bring us back into the history of Detroit, because Detroit has actually been one of the sites where community policing was experimented with in one of the most thoroughgoing ways in the country. And the slide that David's on right now mentions, if you go back, no, it's all right. And I thank you for doing this. But this is the crux of the issue that we face with community policing today. And that is that right after George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, the president of the Minneapolis City Council, Lisa Bender, noted that Minneapolis had been, I mean, for a long time, but in particular since 2014, a pilot city for community policing reforms. And as she said, all those efforts still didn't stop George Floyd's death. So what I'm kind of juxtaposing here is the limitations of community policing with the ongoing police violence and the movement against it that's emerged, that I think is so powerful and important. So let's go back, David. No, I'm sorry, to the promise of Coleman Young. So we're going back in time, forward in the forward in the slideshow. I apologize. um, and so the next thing I want to mention is the promise of Coleman Young. And his promise was that he wanted to build a people's police department. So in his election, and so I'll get to that. And this promise was particularly pressing in Detroit, given the uprising in 1967, slide, and ongoing police violence, such as the Veterans Memorial conflict that happened in 1968. And this was just one example of the conflicts that were kind of continuing between police officers and young people in the city. In the wake of this, you have the emergence of a movement against this unit called Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets, which I'm sure many of us are very familiar with, so I won't dwell on it too much. But the crucial thing is that, as you can kind of observe from this photo and from the pamphlet that follows, is this was a movement that was just a powerful movement demanding police reform, especially the abolition of the stress program. So in a sense, an abolitionist movement. But it wasn't quite the same as the stuff that we're witnessing today. It was also a multiracial movement that brought together a whole bunch of social movements that were taking place in the city to oppose this stress program. And so what that meant was that going into the 1973 election, there was a lot of conflict going on in the city. And Young's platform was partially about reforming the police department in order to kind of stabilize the economic situation for investment. I mean, among other things, but that was crucial to one of the things that he was doing. The 1973 election was really crucial because it pitted what the Free Press called a conservative career cop against a liberal Black civil rights leader, right? So that was the stakes in the 1973 election. And Coleman Young's police reform program, as I said, he called it a people's police department. But it consisted of things like I've listed on this slide, which was dozens of neighborhood police stations, police ingratiating themselves with the community through walking the beat, attending and organizing meetings, hosting youth recreational programs, increasing diversity in hiring, implementing residency requirements, and also training programs about racial bias and police procedures. And the reason that I've listed these so extensively here is because I think it's important to demonstrate the connections between this set of reforms and the 1994 crime bill, the 21st Century Task Force on Policing, and so forth. So we have a very clear sense that there's a strong continuity between this set of reforms associated with community policing that goes back to Detroit as a sort of laboratory for the introduction of these things, right? So we've been operating on the community policing principle since much longer than since 1994. That's the big takeaway. And in the next slide, what's also crucial to understand about the community policing reforms is that just as Young was introducing this People's Police Department, he was also emphasizing that he would take a strict stand on maintaining order in the city. As this is, again, Remmer Tyson from July 1973. This is the beginning of Coleman Young's campaign. He starts that campaign by saying he wanted to end the blackjack rule of terror that John Nichols had introduced because he was the commissioner when stress was introduced, and he's now running for mayor. So those are, again, the implications of this contest. And second, he said he would fire John Nichols. Right, so he made police reform the very core of the 1973 election campaign, and in that he may have taken a lesson from Philadelphia, where Frank Rizzo, who was then the police commissioner, had won the previous year on a very firm law and order campaign. So what Young does by saying he says he'll reform the police department by firing Nichols and abolishing stress, but then he also very clearly states, as in the next slide says, John Nichols did not do the job. So Young was going to be better on crime than Nichols was, right? And that's again crucial, because we need to recognize that within the community policing reforms, there's also the demand to maintain order, right? So even in Executive Order number 2, which is issued less than a month, I think, after Young becomes mayor, he lists all of these reforms that are related to his program that he wants to implement. And then at the same time, he says, I want the Okay, so he's like, now job is finished. We have reconfigured the police department. It's cool. And then he says, next, I want the police to wage an all-out war on crime. Right, so that's the very same executive order. He does both of those things. And then this is, again, I'll just note in passing, Young's infamous inaugural speech. He gets kind of blamed for ratcheting up the tension with the suburbs by saying that he wanted, criminals to hit the road. And of course, the Detroit News interprets it as he's sending criminals to the suburbs. Actually, what he was saying was he was going to be as tough on criminals as he was going to be on criminal police officers, right? So that was, I don't know, that's just some further cynicism by the suburbs when they're interpreting it in that way. But I think what we've overlooked is how tough Coleman Young promised to be on crime when he was still demanding to reform it. So that gives you a sense of the stakes of that election. Go ahead, David. So community policing, you can go ahead. It's a new orthodoxy in policing. It emerges from experiments like the Kansas City Preventive Patrol experiment, which said that police in automobiles had very little effect on crime, and in fact alienated the police officers from the community by creating distance between them. Next is the Newark experiment, which emphasized foot patrol and came back with positive responses about how foot patrol helped mediate the tense relationship between police and community. And you can move on. So that's kind of the background experiments that we are familiar with for establishing what we understand as community policing. But my point here is that Coleman Young's reform program is a part of this as well. So you have some new tactics in community policing that I notice here, which are foot patrols, focus on minor offenses or misdemeanors, educational and recreational programs for young people. So that would mean like police athletic leagues, for example, and then also community organizing projects, and that becomes important later. So go ahead. Community policing also has a continuity with broken windows that I think we have not emphasized enough and has been overlooked. Go ahead, David. And so this is James Wilson, who wrote the infamous Broken Windows article that appeared in the Atlantic in the early 1980s. And what he says explicitly is Broken Windows was about community policing. It was about bringing the police and the community closer together. So right at the outset, when he's writing his Broken Windows article, which draws on that Newark experiment and that Kansas City experiment explicitly, he's making a connection about community policing and the style of policing that Broken Windows introduced. Go ahead. So there's a big difference. So another thing that's important to recognize about community policing is the differences that it makes in the communities that it's introduced into. And so I have a few points about that. Go ahead. So community policing defines community by exclusion as much as inclusion. Next. And so what you see, this is a quote from the Broken Windows article, is that they set a whole host of exclusions from the idea of community. And what I mean by that is the people who are going to be subject to policing are the people that are excluded from community. So what you see here is they even emphasize not necessarily violent people or criminals, but disorderly people, meaning disreputable, obstreperous, unpredictable people. Panhandlers, drunks, addicts, rowdy teenagers, prostitutes, loiterers, the mentally disturbed. They're creating an entire set of people who are excluded from community and on whom policing will be enforced, right? And we get a sense of this with, for example, the uptick in mentally ill people that are confined in prisons from this period onward, right? That has a complicated history, but this is part of it. In this next one, we see that they note at the outset that the beat officer, this new beat officer that's being reintroduced, who had been done away with in the 1940s and 50s, is tasked with keeping order on these disreputable regulars and people that loiter, people that lack any means of support, noisy teenagers. And again, that's really important in the context of Detroit, when teenagers were so crucial in the 1970s and 80s to the enforcement of order. It's also important to note here, as they say, the businessman was assumed to be right? So it also establishes a class basis about who is part of the community and who is excluded from that community. Go ahead. Another thing community does is it criminalizes Black youth and other marginalized and oppressed people. Go ahead. This article is called One Night's Prowl on the City Streets. You might think of this because it appears in the Detroit News, if you can recognize the font. You can say, oh, this is probably a bunch of teenagers prowling the streets in the terms of the sensationalized version of news reporting that the Detroit News often does. But in fact, it's an article about a journalist embedded within a police squad car, observing the police prowling the city streets. And as they note, I won't go into all of it, essentially the journalist says that the police officers that they were embedded with stopped every single teenager that they saw and frisked them and harassed them and so forth. And this is November 16th, 1975. And so part of the purpose of demonstrating this is to show you the continuities within the reforms that Young had implemented. So go ahead, next. Community policing also expands a city's carceral footprint, and we can kind of move through these slides quickly. This first one is the police stations. The next one is police stations plus mini stations by 1974. So you're already seeing the way that the amount of police, the physical footprint of policing is expanding. And then 3 years later, in 1977, you can see that it's expanded dramatically. I believe that this is the moment when there's 50 neighborhood police stations operational. This maybe this is not convincing enough, or you want to see more. Well, the other thing that we have to note, which is in the next slides, is that community policing undermines access to public space. And if you move on, this is an interoffice memorandum from Jeffrey Taft, who was the attorney of the Detroit Police Department, to Philip Tanyan, who was one of the assistant police chiefs, I guess. He's the chief right now. This is before Cobo. And what Taft is doing is he's laying out a legal rationale, drawing on the Terry decision of the Supreme Court a few years earlier, for how the Detroit Police Department can harass young people in the downtown business district without sort of arresting them, right? But trying to get them to sort of get us to just make it uncomfortable for them to be downtown. So in doing that, it starts to undermine young people's access to public space in the city. Go ahead. So community policing, if you go up to the header or whatever, community policing also undermines the right to privacy. And as you'll see in the next slide, this is a mini station activity report for the 5 months from February to July 1976. And in the next slide, you'll note that community meetings attended by police officers in this 5-month period was over 100. So that means that just regular meetings that people are having, there's a police officer present at. In addition to that, as you'll see in the felony arrests and the misdemeanor arrests in particular, police had arrested 3,000 people in this 5-month period that they attributed solely to the existence of mini stations. So that's also something that's important. But here I want to concentrate on the community meetings attended because of the way that the difficulty that we have in developing an autonomous politics if police are showing up at all of our meetings, right? And so so I'll just leave it at that for now. David, go ahead. Community policing also naturalizes the presence of law enforcement in our daily lives. You can move on, David. And here's a proposed foot patrol route. So alongside all of those neighborhood police stations that we saw a few slides ago, police officers, this is what it meant to walk the beat, is essentially to walk through every crevice in every neighborhood that a neighborhood police department exists, right? So the purpose of including this map is to give you a sense of how much it multiplies the police presence in people's lives by the introduction of neighborhood community policing stations. Go ahead. So community policing today, Project Greenlight, you can see the little lights from the Project Greenlight. If you move on, I have just a couple of points here about this. community policing faces an insurgent challenge from below. That's what the movement today represents, is a challenge to the way that community policing has ordered our cities and our lives since its introduction in the 1970s. Go ahead. You can see a contrast, a pretty stark contrast between the types of reforms that the present sort of Democratic Party structure is implementing, and what the movement, at least in the 2013-2014 period, suggested. And here you have a statement from the Movement for Black Lives policy statement, and that is direct democratic community control of local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. That's a stunning contrast with the Democratic Party's policy, and it's kind of, you might say, I would like to know more about how we analyze it in the context of the current movement. And thus far, the main proponents of community policing have doubled down on that community policing rather than address the criticism raised by the movement and the alternatives such as defund and abolition that it's advocated. Go ahead. And then finally, community policing has been, well, I think I have a couple more. Community policing has been discredited in the experiences of those people most subject to police violence. And so we could make reference to all kinds of different moments, but I'll hold off for now. Is there any more, David? Well, well, there's this is another criticism that this is some of the stuff that the movement is raising that hasn't been implemented, and that is that merchandise can be replaced, Black lives cannot. Right. And this is a critique of policing as well as private property that has not been touched by the community policing reform program. The next one. Another way of saying that is that Black lives matter more than private property. That's a crucial demand that the movement is making by spray painting stuff like that on the walls. And then one more. Finally, the future of policing is the movement to abolish the police. And by that, I mean that the strength of that movement will determine how much reform to policing we get in the present period. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Let me try and unshare my screen real quickly. All right. And I'm going to ask some questions of you later. But we're going to move on to Melba. And let me set you up a little bit, Melba. Part of the kind of push for community policing and Young's kind of rise to power was his critique of stress, as Michael mentioned. And stress wreaked havoc on the Black community and on families and on people's lives, Melba's included. So I'm going to bring up Melba to have her talk to you all about her experiences with stress and her brother. Melba, welcome.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Very interesting discussion, Michael. And so many things were going through my head while you were pointing out these different points and counterpoints. And I would like to comment or sort of interface also with some of the points that you made. In particular, I was thinking of growing up in the city of Detroit and young people when I was in high school in the 1960s, the sort of fear that the Big Four used to sort of affect teenage populations. And they would pull up in front of high schools, I know in particular mine, and they would harass young Black men, teenagers who were doing nothing more than, waiting at a bus stop to go home after classes. And so the Big Four basically were in the process of, I think, conditioning us to fear the police. And they had a free rein to do that. And this led ultimately that, among all of the other aspects of Detroit policing, to the 1967 rebellion. And again, that historical moment was the consequence of police harassment. And again, ironically, at an after hours establishment where there was a party going on to celebrate the return of two Vietnam veterans. And I think that that's also very ironic, because this country always likes to purport about how much they care about our veterans, and, you know, and how much they're fighting and for our democracy and all of that. And yet, when it comes to certain moments in historical circumstances, once they got back to Detroit, they were just, you know, two other Black men whose lives were no more important than any other Black person. So that is what instigated the conflict that evening, and also just the long-term experience with police harassment. And I think it's important to understand how this leads up to, and I've been doing actually some work more recently and looking at the experience of Black women on the Detroit police force, which was almost not in existence, with the exception of some very, very rare instances where they were hired to work with, and this is women, not just Black women, but women in general, to work and say with juveniles. But they were not a part of the regular sort of policing of the streets and so forth until we get into the Young administration and the change and the reforms that are implemented. And there's one interview that appeared in the newspaper, which I used, with a Black woman who was actually the coroner. And she was the first Black woman hired by Detroit Police Department, which I found ironic, that you have to be a doctor if you're a Black woman to work for the police force in the 1960s. And she talked about how the police would come in and talk about and share with each other how many, you know, and people have you got today? How many did you shoot today? And what people have to understand in terms of the hostility, the historical hostility between the Black community and the police department, was the fact that they would just kill you. And there was no consequence for that, for those actions. They were free to go hunting, you know? And so that anger and that hostility leads to the '67 rebellion. And that rebellion was not simply, as a lot of people think of, a riot of folks just breaking down store windows and stealing stuff, but it was an armed struggle with the police and snipers and so forth. And that struggle, or that particular instance, historical moment, led not to them coming aware of the problem. We're trying to address the problem. As the Kerner report actually stated, that police repression was one of the main causes of, you know, riots, rebellion in the United States. But instead of the Detroit Police Department addressing that issue, they made it worse by creating stress. They intensified that repression on the Black community. And certainly in the case of some of what you reported here, the harassment of young Black men, which people have to understand, again, is to precondition you. It's just like slavery. You try to condition the slave to be afraid to, you know, when the police show up. And also the point that, again, what was in your studies that you're referencing, and I thank you so much for your presentation, was the fact that crime was still rampant. They weren't interested in dealing with criminals in the Black community. If anything, they were harassing, you know, abiding citizens who are not doing anything other than walking down the street, which is allegedly their constitutional right. So they didn't care about that. So when we get to the stress situation or confrontation in 1972, that is actually the consequence of my brother, John Percy Boyd, my cousin, Hayward Brown, and Mark Bethune, among a number of young Black people in the city, who decided that one of the main problems that the community had to deal with and face was the onslaught of heroin into the Black community. And that was also, that's a whole nother discussion you could have later. But the thing is that it was in fact heroin addiction and the dissemination of heroin into the Black community that was creating a lot of the crime. You know, the breaking into people's houses, the robbing of people on the streets. You know, so the heroin trafficking, there was absolutely no interest in the Detroit police to end, you know, the sale of heroin and these kinds of opioids in the Black community. And in fact, we see a rise in that, and there's all kinds of discussions about where do these drugs come from? And I'm not gonna go into any of my theories about that. But the fact is that this appears at a moment after you have these rebellions across the country in the cities, and the influx of heroin into the community was indeed to actually sort of abate the radicalism that was occurring in the cities at that time. So that instead of having young people who were interested in joining, say, the League or SNCC or any of these organizations, and certainly we were having demonstrations in high schools against discrimination and, you know, insufficient curriculum in the city. There were demonstrations clearly, you know, on college campuses and, you know, and what all did that mean? So they wanted to stop that, the growth of that and the spread of that radicalism. And you do that by, you know, giving them narcotics. You know, this is nothing new in world history, okay? The Opium Wars and all of that. So what happens is stress is created. And so the shootout that occurs between Boyd, Brown, and Bethune is basically the consequence of an encounter with police who were guarding a drug house. So that them having that, you know, running at that particular moment, you know, on December 4th in 1972 was probably inevitable, because it's not just that we're talking about the police harassing communities, we're also talking about the fact that the police were profiting from crime that was occurring in the community. Okay, so it's very complicated, it's very difficult. And when Coleman Young, as you indicated, is elected, he's essentially elected because out of all of the candidates who were running, liberal and otherwise, he is the one candidate who says, the first thing I'm gonna do is fire the police chief and get rid of stress. And so he actually becomes the mayor because, unlike the other candidates, no one has taken a strong stance on police, okay? And consequently, we began to see police reform when Young comes into office. And I hope Greg speaks a little bit to this when he speaks, but it's really important also to mention that during this police reform that takes place, that there was a police commission put in place, an oversight to have citizens, not police, policing police. And that's extremely important if you want to make police accountable to the citizens that they allegedly serve. And so that's a big part of police reform. And likewise, the changing of the population itself of police, right? Changing the demographic, changing the police need to live in the city. The police need to reflect the population that they are, quote unquote, policing. You need to have more women on the police force so that you can like bring some of that testosterone down, and also to have people who think differently when they're dealing with conflict. So I think I'm running out of time at this point, but I just want to say that the whole issue around policing in the Black community has to also be taken in consideration with the fact that the crime, a lot of the crime was being perpetuated by the police. We've got police killing Black people, you know, bodies just showing up in alleys. You've got a situation where I think there was a report in Time magazine in 1971 that said that more Black people have been killed in Detroit by police than the number of people killed in the war in Ireland. Okay, so we're talking about a situation that's more that is as complicated about having to have, of course you need law and order, but first of all, you got to have police who care about serving the people and dealing with the criminals, and not the criminalization of the people themselves, as you so aptly pointed out. So it is very complicated and difficult, but I think there's certain things that were done in the past that need to continue to be pursued. I think police need to be better educated. They need to have a better awareness of cultural differences, historical backgrounds of different communities, respect for those histories, and also not be so arrogant and insensitive to what the law is actually supposed to be about. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. The only other thing I would have done would have been to read a poem, but I'm not going to do that right now.
Melba, I told you I was going to ask you some questions. So one thing I'd like for you to cover that I don't believe you did, but to talk about following the shootout, kind of the police rampage on the Black community and the lawsuit a little bit.
Yeah, well, after the shootout, there was an intensification of stress behavior, and certainly then the police become a part of it, because if you shoot a cop, then all hell breaks loose. And so the police force response then was to attack Black people in general, and the family and friends of Boyd Brown and Bethune specifically. And as a consequence, they were breaking into our houses, arresting us with no charge, and just sort of intensified what they were already doing. Of course, in our response, our family response was to seek some kind of legal relief. And we filed a suit against the police department in the city of Detroit. And that lawsuit actually had an impact on Michigan law, which basically decided that police cannot enter a domicile without a search warrant unless they are in hot pursuit. In other words, just because John Boyd is my brother, you can't come to my apartment and just, break in the door and ransack, the whole place. You can't follow me to my place of work. At the time I was teaching at Cass Tech High School, and coming down there and trying to even come, if you can imagine, to my classroom, which didn't happen because the assistant principal said, no, not going to happen, leave. But I have to say also, and I want to reiterate, that the community did come out in force in support. That's when I met Greg Hicks and Ken Cockrell. There was a whole movement against stress that was already, in force, and people came out. We organized and worked with people like Ron Scott, Families Under Stress, and we held rallies. We raised money for Haywood's defense, and even Aretha Franklin's father took up a collection one Sunday when we came to the church. I mean, the people were really just totally at odds and against stress and the behavior of the police department. And the thing was, they did not realize that we would have, the wherewithal, the energy, the resistance to stand up to them and to call them out. And also we call the Black press, which is extremely important, because the free press and the news were reporting only what the police would tell them. So by contacting the Michigan Chronicle, they came out, took pictures of my parents' home, they interviewed us, and they ran articles on the front page of the paper. And people were enlightened by actually what the police were doing, and not having to rely on the standard line and from the what was fake news in the real sense of the word.
Thank you, Melba. All right, Greg, you ready to get started? Welcome. Can't hear you, Greg.
All right, I unmuted myself.
There you go.
Well, I don't, I want to cover a couple of, well, a couple of things. There's a general tendency for people like me to go back and kind of fill in some of the history and so forth. And I think that's really important because I think that people ought to say the names and record the history, because we're essentially talking about marginalized voices during that period of time, and to what degree have they been recorded, and therefore what have we learned over time. Having said that, and I really appreciate Melba's winding things in and things like that. Those are important, but I want to back up a little bit and talk about a frame first of all. Okay. Now, when I say a frame, what I mean by that is, what do police do? You know, in a civil society, I mean, what's the purpose of police? And what's the history that defines that in real time? Well, obviously, it is to, it exists to try and handle some of the conflict that you have in society. At the same time, that's informed by historical situations. When we came out of slavery, and you essentially had overseers who had hired people to come back and find us in northern areas and return us into slavery, all of that. And there was a certain kind of, from its inception, there were two things that came out of that. One was a relationship between the Black community and police, where the police were essentially armies that exist to from its beginning to take advantage of us, to control us, and so forth. The other thing that came out of that was a response that the society needed relative to a capital need. It needed labor, and the cheapest labor coming outside of, when you come out of slavery, and the cheapest labor is to get people who work in chain gangs, and you work chain gangs. I mean, they weren't paid. So you got there's a labor component that's associated with that. One of the things that I can remember, and I'm glad that this is being sponsored by the General Baker Institute, because one of the things that Jen, and I say that affectionately, that Jen talked about during the days of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers was that relationship in terms of the labor component with it. But that's one thing that I think that we want to clearly, as a frame, want to understand. We also understand that police officers, they're individuals just like you and I. I mean, there's some pretty good people. They have families, they have responsibilities, they go to work. A lot of them see their responsibility as workers who happen to be involved in law enforcement, as opposed to the leadership, if you will, of police departments who don't see themselves as workers and engage in that same way. They have different philosophical bents, if you will, in terms of the role in which police play. And so you get to these kind of types, if you will. You have a type, and we see that in the city of Detroit. You have a type where they're kind of like militaristic, Gestapo-oriented, and they exist essentially in terms of the way in which they practice is to really ride roughshod over a community. As opposed to another form, which kind of gets at the notion of community policing. I haven't seen a lot of personality types associated with it, but the notion of a more protective and engaged and informed interaction with the community and so forth. So, I mean, those are kind of like frames, if you will. Ultimately, in terms of, and I want to put this one up front, because if I don't get to it later on, I don't want to miss it. The big challenge for, as I see it, is this integration, if you will, between policing and the expanded role and responsibility that we've given them, and the emergence of big data in our society. I mean, that's in one sense, we used to have police officers who would collect through varying investigations, collect the number of mug shots, would go over these mug shots, and at one point or another, they would determine that they got the criminal or whatever the case may be. Well, in today's society, this stuff is amplified 20, 30, 40 billion times over. They're accessing major databases in terms of licenses, any kind of service, generally speaking, that society, that government provides, and there's a database associated with, you're seeing the integration of this type of data. So if you think of the movie, what was that movie where they were talking about future crime, and they would get to the point where they would have so much data that they could predict crime. Okay, and this is a situation where essentially where you're allowing for the technology to go almost unabated to run loose in our society. And that's in part, that was the issue around the discussion around green light here in the city of Detroit and that type of thing. But you got to also bear in mind, just as the city formally is collecting this kind of data and engaging with, like if you say the surveillance issue, we had a discussion with the Board of Police Commissioner about a couple of years ago around this particular issue, but this was facial recognition as an issue. But at the same time, the Michigan State Police had been using facial recognition for 17, 18 years, So, I mean, in a lot of ways, the Detroit Police Department formally is a Johnny-come-lately to that kind of situation. So the other part of this, though, and what we don't talk about a great deal, is that when you look at some of Detroit's corporate leaders, like the Dan Gilbert's organization and all of that, these people have military and surveillance capability that is almost equal to that which exists in the public sector. And there's a level of coordination and activity that's going on between them that I think has tremendous consequences in terms of issues of privacy and how we run or do things in our society. You even go back to one of the cases, this is years and years ago, cases where Ken Cockrell and Justin Rabbits was involved with. This was a lawsuit against discriminatory practices with the Detroit Edison, for example. And I'm talking literally 30 years ago. But what Detroit Edison was doing at that time was sharing information. When a person came into Detroit Edison seeking employment, Detroit Edison would obtain information from the police department. And if you were on any of the police department's lists, of course, you were denied employment. So there was this sharing of information, if you will. And at the same time, we had, it was going on nationally, but we had the red files, for example, in the city of Detroit. And I think if you were a Detroiter, born and raised and had any consciousness about you in Detroit, you had a red file. So there was this kind of systematic denial, if you will, of even employment opportunities and things like that. So we have to put those types of things in context. If I were to go back in terms of my personal experience, one other issue. When we talk about the personalities and style and approaches of the departments, we should not exclude, and I would hope that there would be more discussion on this, even in some of the scholarly research, on the role of police unions. Police unions, more than, I think, well, not more than, but equal to police administrators are involved with actually diminishing the ability for the department or the public to know what's going on and to seek disciplinary action against some of the worst behaviors on the police department. So that at some point that should be put into the equation. If we go back in terms of just the history, Melba described a fairly major march. It was called the State of Emergency March. And this was following, this was the build up toward the anti-stress coalition. I can recall a meeting that took place with Ken Cockrell, myself, and at that time, candidate Coleman Young. So this is before Young becomes mayor. And what Young he came over to Kenny's house and asked for Kenny's support because Kenny was a known leftist, progressive, revolutionary in the city. And Kenny's activity was part and parcel and even supported by the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which had broader reach, not only into the plants, but into the communities and so forth. But in that situation, we had a discussion with Mayor Young, and Mayor Young asked for Kenny's support. And Kenny said to him in this meeting, this was long before Mayor Young won the legal case that allowed for him to run, because you remember he was barred from running at first. And Kenny just indicated to him, look, unless you make a commitment to do something on the stress union, I can't join you. And in addition to that, Kenny very directly said that trust has to be earned. So if you notice at the beginning of the Coleman Young administration, leftists like Ken and people like that were not part of that administration. In fact, they stayed on the outside of the administration, continuing to force even the Coleman Young. So it wasn't just the John Nichols forcing the John Nichols as police chief to do the right thing, but it was also the need for social activists like Cockrell and others to even stay in Young's ass, because simply a commitment to do something is quite different from when the person takes the seat and so forth. And that process continued all the way up. And it wasn't just here locally and so forth. I can remember even, as Melba mentioned, Hayward Brown. When Hayward was being tried, I was a part of Hayward's defense team. I was an investigator with Kenny's firm at that time, and I had the responsibility of riding or bringing Hayward to court every day. And because we had him in a safe house, and because we were very concerned about that he would have the same kind of fate as his two comrades, because the police were very serious about trying to just eliminate this situation. And Hayward, and I wanted to just say this because the observation that Melba made relative to the central concern about narcotics in our community was a critical motivation for clearly that group of young people. But more than that, it was essentially really the reasons why we were experiencing the kind of crime which Melba pointed out, and it created the environment, if you will, that literally led to, which is also the case kind of like today, where even Black folks supported increases in the militarization, of police and all this kind of stuff. You got to remember, large part, we were, as a community, we were victimized. We were victimized by police themselves, but we were also victimized by criminals. And leading that was the dope man and and really the inability for even the law enforcement people to do anything real on that. Back during that period of time, which people may not know, there was a time where the police officers were caught in trafficking in narcotics. In fact, an entire police precinct, the 10th precinct, which is located all over Livernois and Fullerton, its parallel today is that we got 28 officers today who are currently under investigation for trafficking in narcotics. We have a strange situation where the Detroit Police Department is conducting its own investigation of itself on these types of things, which I think is really kind of like a crazy kind of notion. I think that some independent entity ought to be conducting that investigation. But having said that, the point that I'm trying to make is that we tend to miss the kind of, oftentimes in this discussion, the kind of systematic activity that's taking place. We have the police themselves. We also have, standing with the police, the prosecutor, and the inability for the prosecutor to bring charges, or as Melba had talked about, and I don't know if she talked, she talked about it, was the prosecutors actually responding in such a way where they would charge folks. So if you get into a conflict with a police officer and so forth, they would come up with a trumped up charge. They would always overcharge you, which was a means of control, if you will, even amongst people who tended to be prepared to just not accept this kind of police brutality back in the day and so forth. And obviously, when you put those things together, the police, the prosecutor, which leads to, of course, increased interactions that we had with the law enforcement apparatus, which led largely to us going to jail or to prison. Its impact in economic terms was dramatic when you think about it, because we have, as we do today, we have hundreds of thousands of African-American men who are not leading a life, if you will, that we'd associate with productive and normal kind of life, because they're in jail. You know, I mean, we have, you know, and when you think of that in economic terms, in terms of opportunity cost, that missed opportunity to a community in order to stabilize itself and be involved in putting forth, you know, a rational response to the excesses of capitalism, you know, you really just, you have to put those things together, I think, in a frame. In Detroit, when you go back, and David, make sure that I don't go over time. In Detroit, when you go back to the 1970s, early 70s, and the beginning of the Detroit Police Commission and so forth. And I do have to say this to Michael. And Michael, at some point, you need to talk to Jeff Taft. Jeff is still around. The memo that you're using in terms of Jeff Taft, you need to talk to him about that. Jeff was actually, in those days, and remained while he was in the police department, a progressive force. Jeff was not, if you will, a person who was sitting there trying to educate police on how to actually circumvent, you know, the law or anything like that. I mean, you really need to check into that. And as I had said, Jeff is still around. The thing, though, when you go back in terms of the idea here with the police commission was to create a civilian oversight over the police department, because there was historically, and even at that point, and it comes all the way up to today, you just cannot expect for the police as a paramilitary organization to understand the degree to which it wreaks havoc or operates in an excessive fashion in a community. We characterized that in those days as occupation armies. And that's what they were then, they continue to be today. So this whole question of police oversight becomes important. when you go back in Detroit, when you think of the police commission being organized in the early 70s, I think 72, 73, somewhere in the neighborhood, 73, it's one of the oldest police oversight organizations in the country. I think there's only one or two nationally that was older than Detroit. But you have to also understand is that in that long period, there's a maturing, if you will, that takes place in terms of that oversight. That maturing can be good, but that maturing also can be kind of bad, where you become more friendly with the group, with the people that you're providing the oversight with. And I should take the minute to tell you that I'm no longer with the Board of Police Commission. I was terminated from the Board of Police Commission about 9 months ago or 10 months ago. And essentially, in my opinion, is because I was a little more aggressive in trying to make sure that the police commission carried out its responsibility in providing the kind of oversight. But having said that, the critical questions for me is I'm a little concerned with the kind of activity that even some of our activists are involved in. And I say that because we're involved in activism and protests just for the sake of protesting. At some point, when we go back to the league, and this is, I think I mentioned this earlier on just before we came on, when I was, I had to be 17, 18 in that period and involved with the league, there was a slogan that was internal to the league and to the Black Student United Front, which was our organizational base at that time. We were essentially the youth component of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. But in that, there was a saying that said, Black youth, the world is yours, take it. And it wasn't anything that initiated out of the league. In fact, I think France Fanon and some others like that also, and some African revolutionaries had also coined that kind of phrase. We kind of picked it up in our readings and that kind of thing. The way in which we interpreted that was that at some point, there was this view of taking state power. There was no 5 minutes, okay. There's a view of taking state power. I mean, it's not sufficient just simply to stand on the outside and be critical of the state and its operation. At some point, if you have a better view, have a different approach, you have a responsibility to try and intercede and actually take control over the institution and implement whatever your ideas and your concerns are and so forth, okay? And so this raises a fairly healthy tension that goes throughout some of the Detroit stuff, and that's the tension between so-called revolutionary flavor and reformism. And at some point, I don't know that it's good to stand on either side by themselves. It seems to me there's an intersection there that is fairly productive and so forth. And I'm a little concerned that we are not doing the kind of detail work, if you will. We have the Detroit Charter Revision Commission that's going on right now. And in that Charter Commission, we essentially have the ability to rewrite the rules, if you will, of engagement with the department and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not sure that we're focusing in on that and doing the detailed work in connection with those types of things. So I'm gonna kind of like just conclude in that area, and any details that you want to provide or questions, feel free. That's me, Dave.
I was engaged in deep conversation based on something you were saying, but I thank you so much, Greg. I thank all of you. Wonderful presentations tonight. We have a number of questions that I'd like to get into, but I also always want to take my own presenter's prerogative here to bring up a few things, because you jog my memory as you all talk. So I wanted to talk about a few things. One is the kind of fight for residency, right? I study firefighters, you all study police. or have engaged in political struggle against the police. And one of the demands has always been residency requirements. And I think, we associate residency requirements with black cops generally, right? I mean, that's the hook to it. The truth is that I think the majority of black police who now work for the city, it's about a 50-50 split, but it doesn't ensure residency, right? In fact, there was a cop that I watched at a protest regarding Hakeem Littleton, who beat the hell out of my student, Lloyd Simpson. And I should add too, while this was happening, Malik Shabazz stood on the corner and the police did not touch his ass. That should raise questions for some of you that, want to put forth the sinister minister. But beyond that, I will say this is that like that cop was a black cop. He was about, Carolyn was with me and she saw him. She went to Pershing with him. Is that right? I'm sorry to out you, but meanwhile, that same cop got pulled over. He lives in Warren and the police fucked with him and he's filing a multi-million-dollar suit for police harassment, right? So the incongruities here are tremendous. So I think
Dave, can I just interrupt for a little second? Because that's why I'm suggesting that the idea is to look at this more systematically.
absolutely.
Because it's not a question of at one point on the Coleman Young administration, the need to get a department that was more representative of you. We experimented and thought that would bring certain relief to a community.
For sure.
What has happened is that the function of the police, when you get engaged on those types of things, okay, there's the conflict. The conflict is the function, not necessarily the functioneers. So that was the point that I was trying to make, and.
No, I agree. I was just trying to reiterate it and try and understand that we have to look at things historically, right? How things change. Like Keonga Taylor in her book, Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, talks about black people, black faces in high places, right? So one of the ways that the establishment kind of like dealt with this was to elevate people. And the best example I could give you for this, to make it more palatable to the community, based on this notion of representation. And that's precisely why Kevin Orr, who was a bankruptcy attorney with very little experience, was selected over somebody with much greater bankruptcy experience, because he was black and they felt like they could sell that better. And so in many ways, that's what kind of happens with residency today. It was mentioned earlier about the importance of the black press and getting to the black press to get out the stories of what was really happening with the police. That's a tremendous loss that we have here, because we don't have a black press, really. I mean, we have the Chronicle still, but it's basically, its survival is based on its ability to draw revenue from the big three, basically. And they have no ability to speak autonomously. So if we're looking at the situation with Detroit police and the community, right, when the Michigan Citizens ends its run, you really can't get an independent voice that speaks on behalf of the people. And that's tragic. And we need to fill that void, I think. You mentioned heroin, and later next week, we're going to be talking about crack. So I just wanted to kind of talk about the relationship between perceptions and the way that crime is sold, particularly in the suburbs, not only to black people, not only to white people, but to black people too, is this impending doom. And this is oftentimes used as a means, of course, it's racialized heavily, but it's used as a mean to expand police budgets, which of course expands incarceration and brutality. I want to give a shout out to Greg. First of all, Greg asked me to be he was part of the Detroit Charter Commission, and it was during the Kilpatrick administration. And they wanted to do a public access thing about corruption in the city. And I was so glad he asked me, because I got to do a Detroit public TV spot about all the fucked up white mayors we had, because everybody was focusing on Kilpatrick at that time. So shout out to you for that. And then one thing, because Max is here from last week, Faulkner Cantor, and Max in his book does an excellent job of explaining how police oftentimes manipulate kind of verbiage, right, to continue the same policies. So Coleman Young effectively ends stress, right, stress by name, but then forms a gang squad that winds up doing very similar shit, right? So the police have a very inventive way of kind of like dismantling programs that catch hell, right? But basically farming them out to other groups. So I'll give you this example from more recent time with the Detroit police. Ralph Godbee's, before the current chief, Jimmy Craig, Ralph Godbee's gang squad was getting in all kinds of trouble for beating the hell out of people and for selling drugs, very similar to today. What did he do? He disbanded that unit and called it the tactical whatever, whatever. Right now, all of a sudden, when Craig came in, he changed the tactical whatever, whatever into the gang squad again. So it's a shell game oftentimes because there is no accountability, because they've captured these review boards and kind of moved away from these reforms through the police unions, oftentimes through the process of arbitration. Okay, last thing, and I want to get my jibs in on this because I forgot to last week. Greg brought up an excellent point about surveillance and how that's been ramped up exponentially in more recent times. Let me give a shout out to my university, Wayne State, because we are number one. We are number one in police surveillance of our campus nationally. We have 2,000 cameras on campus that have facial recognition capabilities, whether or not Wayne has the software, DPD certainly does, and the Michigan State Police certainly does, and they all share the same fucking cloud, and then all that information goes to the real crime center. So whether they want to say they're doing it here, Duggan for years said they didn't do facial recognition, right? And what he was basically saying is we don't do it here in the city, it's done in the cloud. That's how he lied. They had that technology, they were doing it, but they're not physically running it through a computer here, it's up in the cloud. That's how Duggan lied for years, 2 years before he acknowledged that they had it, right? So we have, not only does Wayne State have these 2,000 cameras, and the only university that's even close is Penn State University, which is in the middle of nowhere, right? And it's a huge campus. They have 2,000 cameras too, right? Much bigger campus. Per capita, Wayne State, number one. All right, and I'll bring that up to another thing about Wayne State's campus that I really like to point out because they're sponsoring this event today, right? And that is the fact that Wayne State University runs the CompStat program for the entire Detroit Police Department, every precinct, right? So when Greg, when Michael, when Melba, when people are talking about predictive policing, where police are operating on the idea that you can anticipate crime, lo and behold, where do you think they anticipate crime? In Black and poor communities, right? All that data is done through graduate students from the Center for Urban Studies at Wayne State University and is then distributed to the entire Detroit Police Department, right? So when you talk about this vast network, right, this is funded by a multi-billion-dollar grant at the state level with Motorola, right? You could all look this up. It's publicly available. Right, so Greg was not lying. Greg, go ahead.
Dave, another point on that, because when you look at, because the CompStat, this is part of what Mike started off talking about in terms of the kind of migration, if you will, in terms of police practices and all of this type of stuff, and this whole notion of, you know, if you get away from broken windows and you go into more data-driven kinds of approaches and so forth, you get to this CompStat thing. And CompStat probably provides a police with better data in order to operate with. But the issue is when the police violate and abuse their roles and responsibilities, there is no disciplinary activity that takes place. So, I mean, you have, you know, like a chief of police sitting on top of all this CompStat data and is seeing these trends and all this kind of stuff, and seeing also the reaction that is his patrol force and other people under his employment have, and there's questions of abuse and things like that. And then there is, in terms of police oversight, he refuses to share real information up to and including the disciplinary information about this kind of rogue police, if you will. That then, you turn the corner on that, that gets to a situation where you have the police unions sitting there operating as a protector of a labor protector, if you will, and they put in their contracts, for example, for promotional purposes and so forth, that you cannot use the disciplinary history of the officers, and that type of thing. So at some point, how do you bring the discipline and stop the kind of abuses unless you get to the details and make those types of corrections? Just because Detroit is a labor town and we want labor peace and everything, in every contract, we shouldn't sell out baseline rights, if you will, that'll protect that will protect citizens here. To let officers continue to operate where the discipline that they accumulate as a result of their bad practices does not work against them being on a department, that it's crazy. It just makes no sense.
Absolutely. I just want to add a little something here before we end. Thank you so much, Greg, for getting into that critical point.
I can't hear you with that thing over here.
What I don't understand about the lack of sense of responsibility for police officers has to do, when I think about, all of the requirements that I have had to go through in order to be a professor at the university, and et cetera, et cetera. And I always said, well, if I really mess up one day, the worst I would do would be to confuse a few students. But when a police officer really messes up, we're talking, oftentimes, life and death situation. And there should be far more stringent requirements for people to be in that capacity, because they have a lot of power and the response to that power. I mentioned earlier about interviewing women police officers and their experience, and I've learned a lot. And Greg, you may know more about this, but when we talk about all this data-driven and all of this information, how they can predict where crime is going to be, there's also testing, psychological testing that could be made and executed when you hire someone on the police force. There is a way that you can identify certain kinds of psychological abnormalities, a propensity for excessive violence, the capacity or lack thereof to engage a situation, diffuse that without having to result necessarily to violence. That's the kind of scrutiny that should occur even before a policeman is hired. They're in too important of a position with too much power to not have that kind of testing to be implemented to determine what is the psychology, what is the mentality of this person who we're about to give a gun, and access to our population. And there are tests that can actually anticipate certain kinds of personalities, certain kinds of traits, and that needs to be used before a person. It's just, like I said, they have these kinds of tests for people who want to be, in various facets of society. And when that person, again, like you indicated, commits an egregious mistake, we'll call it a mistake, or action, may be deliberate, that person certainly should be further scrutinized because, again, we're all people, as you indicated, and we do know that increasing and diversifying the presence of color and even gender is not necessarily going to solve this problem, because one of my friends who was a policewoman commander of a precinct said, people have to remember that police, regardless of color, are blue.
Right.
And so it's the culture that has to be looked at. The culture has to be re-examined. It has to be restructured. It has to be re-evaluated, because we're talking about a very serious component. You talked about the historical framework. The police came, they were the patrols, like you said, that would capture runaway slaves. That's how the police came into being. And we're looking at the same mentality that's just, just dripping through history and still, acting in a manner that is repressive and dangerous. But at the same time, I'm saying we know how to deal with this. We know how to make the situation better. The question is, are we going to do it?
Yeah.
Melba, can I just say one quick thing?
Wait, hold on. I got to get to some questions, Greg. I'll give you
Okay.
a time in a second. But I will say this, Melba, is like you pointed to like psychological testing of individuals, right? But then you point out that the system is rotten anyway. So like, you know, it's like you can screen people and that's good to keep out bad apples. But part of I think that, you know, what George Floyd shows you with the arrest of all the officers that were involved, right, is that there's like a lot of, you know, groupthink, for lack of a better word.
Exactly.
Like
That's the blue component.
Right. This is a structural issue, not necessarily an individual issue, although you have to screen for, you know, you don't want, you know, certain things with police officers, but it's a structural problem to me. Now, let me get to the questions, because we have, Melba, we have a former student who asked a question, and hopefully he could still relate to the working people of Detroit, because he's now at Harvard University. So he probably thinks he's about that life, but he's not really. He's just a working class kid from this area. And his name is Kenneth. And Kenneth asked, can you discuss the storefront mini stations a bit more? And in general, the relationship between small businesses and the police and crime control efforts. And Michael, I'm gonna put this one on you, but before I ask you to answer that, I know that Kenneth has been working a bit about like on small business owners, particularly Chaldean business owners in the 70s and 80s, et cetera.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question, Kenneth. In brief, hand in glove, the relationship between small business owners and the mini stations is a very intimate one. There's a couple of examples that I came across in my research where an African-American man named Brady Keys was sending letters to the Detroit Police Department asking for more supervision of his McDonald's and other sort of like fast food restaurants that he owned. And they responded by, you know, implementing that, having the police officers incorporate visits to those places into their patrols, you know. And then there's also examples of the president of the Downtown Business Association doing similar, sending letters to the Detroit Police Department asking for that kind of stuff and having them respond very quickly to increase the patrolling around those things. And as you point out, the fact that so many of them were located in storefronts also helped kind of further that relationship. But the other thing that I would point out, because I have a chapter that discusses the geography of these mini stations, is that they were located as much in the storefronts as they were in housing projects. And in a lot of ways, they took over from the War on Poverty a lot of the spaces that War on Poverty programs had occupied. So there's also a kind of similarity there running through those programs.
Excellent. All right. Shout out to Elizabeth.
Hey, Dave, can I just go back to one point? Because
go ahead.
I don't want people to be left with the impression that the Detroit Police Department does not provide psychological testing for its officers. They do. The question is the character of the psychological evaluations that take place. I mean, it's one of those kinds of things when you look at like history, for example. You can teach history in a way that has nothing to do because of your frame of what history is, nothing to do with what history was, you know? So, I mean, they kind of missed the mark, if you will, because the extent to which they see us as people, African Americans, they see us as more violent. So in your psychological testings, there is, in effect, an adjustment, if you will, for that kind of violence, because they assume that you're going to encounter that violence. It's a different evaluation if you were sitting in, let's say, in Ann Arbor's police department and going and being evaluated. The person who's doing that evaluation will see two different worlds. And so you get more, I believe, people who are more violent, I mean, who are more bent to, what is it, more machismo, so, that kind of thing. I mean, they in themselves are more forceful as opposed to looking at techniques that exist in policing, like de-escalation and other kinds of things like that. So I just wanted to make that point. They do that, but at some point, this boils down to people themselves.
Yeah,
All right,
absolutely. I agree.
let me ask the next question, and you guys could all talk about this if you want. Can we discuss the role of grassroots community crime control in the city? I found out this person's going on. I found a lot of community organizations who in the 70s and 80s focused a lot on crime, drugs, etc. And they say, in particular, I was thinking of the Rosedale Park Block Club and the other neighborhood orgs, Cass Corridor. But let me just throw this out there. I have a guy that wanted to form a, police patrol kind of neighborhood association. And
Community watch.
Yeah, community watch in my neighborhood. And I realized that this dude was like George Zimmerman, right? But so I'm going to throw this out there. This is my own greed in this question. So there have been a number of activists, both middle-class activists protecting their property, as well as kind of people that have long been considered radicals from the Boggses, right? Whether it was in the early 70s or even So Sad in the 80s, right? Who focus specifically on crime. So does anyone want to take that on in terms of groups that kind of emphasize this issue of, filling in the gap based on kind of like the absence of resources for public safety in their community?
Yeah, let me take a quick crack at it, because I think I would not want to pigeonhole those groups into one monolithic bunch, if you will.
Sure.
When I look at something like So Sad was an organization that responded to death, okay? And so these were largely mothers who were aggrieved by the high level of their children, for example, who were being murdered, some by police, but others was in drug transactions and so forth, okay? So their motivation, if you will, was to show to discuss the humanity and the importance of human life, and for us to consider that in our day-to-day activity. That's a totally different kind of approach to the kind of support organizations that come up where the police are essentially encouraging people to do watch programs and all this kind of stuff. And the police fund a lot of these types of things, okay? That is essentially, in my view, is the police who are overwhelmed and are trying to transfer, if you will, some of their work, if you will, to community people, and to invest community people in a philosophical view that it has about crime and how we should be fearful and so forth. The common police approach is for us to be behind our doors and be frightened like a fuck, and what we should understand is that more engagement inside of our communities, more interaction and more knowledge about our neighbors and so forth actually has the impact of reducing crime, because we know people, we interact with them, we fill up each other's time, if you will, that kind of stuff. So when you look at this, and this dovetails to this whole discussion of defunding police and so forth, okay? And I can't imagine society that we can just abolish the police. I can't imagine that, okay? I can imagine at the same time, however, in looking at the core functions of police and stripping out the budgets and so forth that don't relate to their core functioning, there's no reason why a police department should be responding to a mental health call, for example, okay? In fact, if they respond to a mental health call, they're responding militarily as opposed to a person who is a person who is in need of service, okay? So I can see going through those types of budget and saying, look, this is core, this is not. There's no reason for you to have this over surveillance on us, so strip those kinds of things and so forth. Reinvest that kind of money into public education and other kinds of things that has, as we know, have greater impacts in terms of our long-term value as human beings.
Okay, Michael, I know you talk about this in your work, so could you talk about kind of like the tension between kind of community organizations trying to deal with issues of crime that impact their life and kind of the police?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a difficult question, and I appreciate everything that Greg just mentioned. Yeah, it's a sticky situation. I do talk extensively about SOSAD and similar grassroots community crime control organizations, as the question put it, in my analysis of SOSAD. And I think, I'm not sure if it's I'd like to kind of like maybe like return to the present, and then maybe that helps us go backward a little bit, because I'm thinking about this in terms of, I actually wanted to think it through in terms of this thing that we were mentioning before this whole thing started, David, called modern monetary theory, or MMT. This has been interesting because it's been getting a lot of play recently, and it sort of signifies the rise of like a new theory of money and federal policy around money and that kind of thing. And it strikes me as happening at a fortuitous time when we're also considering police reform in a way that we haven't, really coincidentally since the last monetary reform that we had. Maybe it's not a coincidence, but in any case, there's a way in which the program that Greg is suggesting can kind of like articulate with the program for defunding or abolishing the police. Because it would be a mistake, I think, to return simply to a time when police did the policing, and we had mental health facilities, and we had good health care and all of that kind of stuff, right? Because that's, in a way, by removing police from mental health, you could see an argument for putting. So here's the way that the defund argument could work. You take a portion of the $300 million that the Detroit Police Department gets every year, and you invest some of it in the good old social democratic welfare stuff that's been gutted, right? 330 million, excuse me, sorry about that. So a defund program is, in a certain sense, simply a return to the sort of social welfare state stuff that we had in the 50s and 60s. Although in the present, I think a lot of people would say we should make sure that that kind of social dispensation is not as racist as the previous one that was articulated during the New Deal and had exclusions based on Southern agricultural labor and that kind of thing, right? So a new social democracy would necessarily include that kind of new dispensation. And that's related to this question about the sort of dirty, nitty-gritty detail work that I actually think that the defund and abolition movements are doing. They are in fact getting directly involved in articulating a new program for governing, so to speak, for taking state power. The thing is that they want to, and this is the thing that's fascinating and different, they want to take state power away from some people and diminish state power in a certain sense, or in a more limited way through MMT, take the state power that the police have and give it to social workers who are administering mental health programs and other things like that. So there's a way, I'm sure this is not as clear as it could be, but yeah, I'll stop for now.
Mike, I agree that this question of looking at core policing, dismantling, if you will, functions that are not in the core, that are not policing in character, okay, and that they should be redistributed to other portions of government. I agree with that. The problem, however, is that we're talking about these things in silos. We're talking about looking at the Detroit Police Department, for example, taking its 330 to 360 when you include grants, and reshuffling through that and so forth, okay? The money that's provided police is actually insufficient in terms of what's going on. If the police would conduct reasonable investigations around narcotics trafficking and was looking up the chain of narcotics trafficking, as opposed to just the pusher on the street or something like that. I mean, you're essentially talking about following chains or lanes of money that can go to international types of cabals and those types of things. If the police would do that kind of work, then I would share that 360 million is a reasonable kind of thing. They're not doing that, okay? The other thing is that what we have to do is also watch. The real discussion is the militarization of our overall society. It's not just the question of Detroit. Detroit has tanks which you can roll on the streets, if you will, because they got them from the federal government or purchased them in surplus kinds of situations, all right? So the massive expenditures that we're seeing at the federal level relative to police or military operations, that has to be curtailed too. So we can't separate one discussion from the other, okay? But I do believe that a reasonable citizen discussion about what degree we want to be surveilled, what degree we want to be, patrolled, and how those things interact to what we would accept, if you will, and there's no other way to put this, but accept levels of crime in a community, has to be one that we have to have, because at some point, as a citizen, I want to help define that. I mean, I don't want you to go, the police department, for example, to say that their goal is zero tolerance in terms of crime, and the effect of them implementing a zero tolerance crime program is to divest me of any kind of privacy rights and and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, there's a discussion that the society has to have. We have to come to terms with this, and it's broader than the local unit of government in terms of doing it.
Let me jump in real quick. We got about 15 minutes left. I'd be remiss if I didn't add this comment, a couple comments from the wonderful Anne, and I'll leave it at Anne, but she mentions a few things that I think are important. I think we'll probably agree on. When we talk about defunding or refunding certain programs, that money doesn't necessarily have to, it should come from the police, but it also needs to come from all the rich people and corporations that don't pay tax in the city. So we have to be very intentional, like you were talking about before, Greg, in terms of, understanding this as a structural issue too, within the broader economic system. But then Anne also, who happens to be a social worker by training, right, notes importantly, I think, because sometimes I think it gets easy to, as a defund activist, to say, well, give it to social workers and take the money away from the police, give them budgetary discretion, which makes sense in the sense that it prevents the police from then getting into that program and taking over the funding and then reorienting it to something more punitive, as we kind of read about in Max's book. But she also mentions critically that social workers also often act as state agents themselves. So if we're going to talk about the Police Athletic League and various different intrusions of the state on community, we also have to fundamentally rethink the way that we think about social work as well.
Oh, I agree with you on that, Dave, 100%. When you think about this idea, what we're talking about is rethinking and reimagining a variety of institutions in our society, and probably at its core is the basic question of a capitalist society and how it treats and operates with its people. One of the things that I didn't mention before, and it doesn't normally come up in terms of some of the discussions, but was part of the dissertation work, is that I was looking at questions of alternative economic structures. I think if we had broad-based cooperative businesses and so forth, and the cooperation that flows from those types of things in some of our communities and so forth, we would find ourselves able to make a better division, if you will, as to what this professional needs to be doing, what this section of people needs to be doing, and so forth. We could fare it out better, but we lack the kind of economic base that is not government controlled, if you will, in order to have that kind of rational discussion inside of our community.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree about Anne's point. It's about the social workers, and that's where I was kind of stumbling, because I really don't agree with taking money away from the police and then giving it to social workers who do function as agents of the state. So that's one of the real crucial things. And on that note, that related note, I'm also encouraged by the emergence during this recent uprising of a proliferation of mutual aid societies, which are independent of the state, autonomous of the state, that are working through grassroots efforts. They're not 501c3s, they're just independent little organizations that are functioning in a certain sense like the League used to, if I may be so bold, as these things that are funded themselves, autonomous, rely on the labor of the people that are involved in them directly, those kinds of things. So that could be one alternative that doesn't rely on the state, is that type of mutual aid that has really, again, it's sprung up throughout these things. It happens throughout. Whenever these big crises take place, people organize mutual aid, but we have a tendency not to think of it as the way society should be governed, but as a sort of temporary ancillary to state power. And I think that there's glimmers of us doing this in a way that points toward, exactly as you say, Greg, a different future that I think could be worth exploring.
This dual power, like notions of survival, but with a broader purpose behind it, like the Black Panther Party, used to implement community survival programs. To your point, Mike, I think is a good one. I had a question before, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask it, because I think Melba has seen the movie. I think, and I know Greg must have. So there was a movie put out recently called Dare to Struggle, not Dare to Fight, but Dare to Struggle, Dare to Win, that was done, I believe, by Ken Cockrell's daughter. And we had a question here asking what you thought about the film and basically how it was put together, its general messaging.
Yeah. Hey, I would say this, Dave, there's actually two films that I would call your attention to. One is Dare to Struggle, Dare to Win, which was, Kenny's daughter was an executive producer, I think, inside of it. They put together an amazing team of people to kind of shoot this thing. One of the things that was, and there's been a lot of slippage in the release date of it and so forth. One of the things that has caused that, well, two things. One was there was back during the day when there was a stress shooting outside of the North End Family Center, where Ricardo Buck and Craig Mitchell, if I recall, were assassinated by stress officers who were using entrapment as a practice, if you will. Well, those two young brothers were not the only ones out there that night. There was another Black youth who was out there who got away from that scene that night, left and went south, and was afraid to come back up to the city of Detroit just some damn 30 years later, and they were able to put that piece in the film, and I thought that was pretty good. But the other film that I would also have people go after, Ray Peterson, these were stress officers. One of their kids actually produced the film as well. And that production of that particular film has Ray Peterson and stress officers admitting to the assassination of people on the street, saying that that's what they did, and also Melba, one other quick thing in terms of your investigations with Black female officers, I would include Mary Jarrett Mary Jarrett is the Black female who was in charge of the crime lab back in the day, who is the person who really broke the case in terms of Raymond Peterson killing Robert Hoyt on the expressway, where he planted a knife and that kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I have to admit that I was interviewed for the film, but when they showed the film during the Free Film Festival, I was on a panel about another film and at the same time. So the point is, I can't really comment. I've heard really good things about it. And so I'll just, have to say that. But I think it's important that history is documented. It's another thing about not just the press, but also in a digital world. We need to have people talking about, that history. And it's definitely a film that I'm not only planning to view, I'm planning to purchase, because I really would like to use it, in teaching. But I have not seen the film on the Ray Peterson. I really want to see that because I think that's important. So yeah, I wanted to just make one comment about the sort of the idea of changing the policing. This is something that's needed. It's not an easy fix, but it's so crucial. And so the discussion about social workers, we need even more than just social workers involved in all that. We need educators, we need police to be educated about the history of police so that they can have those considerations that Greg made in terms of what kind of cop do you want to be? Who do you want to represent? And it's not going to be easy. Nothing that's worthwhile is easy, but I think it can be done and we need to do it. And again, we're talking about hitting the whole tax structure. Absolutely. People need to pay taxes. I mean, they take them out of my check every 2 weeks. and I'd like to see something come out of that is making life safer, more worthwhile, instructive, and also positive. And I don't think it's impossible. I mean, we can make this happen. We can make this happen.
Melba, on that note, let me intervene and I'll leave you guys all, and hopefully we could do this a little short. We don't have too much time. So, and this is a complex question, but Craig Register, our comrade, has asked the question last week. Our panelists seemed to be unanimous in believing that police reform was impossible. What do each of you think?
Did you say police reform was impossible?
Reforming the police, like that, their argument was that you'd have to dismantle the entire structure, if not the entire political economy.
Well, yeah. Interesting thing. There's been some police reforms, for example, and I forget the city it was in, and probably Michael may know it better, but they say that they reformed the police. And what they did is they essentially closed down the police operation and then opened it up, really in another name. There may have been more privatization and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, Camden, New Jersey.
Right, so these words, at some point we have to get to the details, of these things. I not only believe that reforming the police is possible, but it's necessary. I mean, how do you not do that? So at a certain point, I don't think that we're ever going to get to a place in our society where abolishing in the technical sense of what abolishment is will take place. Reforming it and have citizens participate, not just live the aftermath of the reform, but have them participate in setting the standards and discussing the levels of intervention that we allow on ourselves, all of those types of things. I mean, that's critical up to and including the level of economic support that we put our public dollars in. And I do want to say this, even though we talked about social workers, the critical issue in terms of policing today, in terms of going to other professionals and so forth, it's really with mental health, not necessarily social workers.
Sure.
And there's a real difference, because mental health responses on the street can clearly save some lives. We've seen one incident after another where the police have over responded on mental health issues. And I think,
Before anyone else jumps in, let me make this one point, and I'll let you two respond afterwards. Colin Rose, some of you might know, was a police officer for the Wayne State Police Department who was killed in the line of duty. And duty, or the line of duty at Wayne State, transcends the boundaries of the campus. And so based on data from CompStat, they were hyper-policing a low-income housing area. And they got a call from that area, and they went to that, Colin Rose went to that area. And he encountered somebody that wound up killing him who had severe mental health problems. And so what I mean by this, just to raise this point, to kind of like make us think about this a little more deeply, is you could have a mental health professional go to that house instead of Colin Rose. But the way that we look at mental health today, the problem would have been he would have been taken to a hospital, he would have been given an outpatient visit, and then he would have been right back where he was, and somebody else may have been called and had that same kind of encounter, right? So it's not only just kind of like calling on mental health professionals, it's the very way that we look at mental health issues and the way that we treat them in terms of a public health crisis. Now, Melba and Michael, if you want to chime in on this question of reform or abolish, or however you want to kind of look at it. I think it's obviously more complex than that, but we have to just kind of look at it like this for the sake of the question. I know.
Okay, I mean, again, as we've been saying, I think all of us are in agreement that none of this is simple and none of this is easy, but it's absolutely necessary. We can also talk about all aspects of reform in so many aspects of society, right? I mean, there's need to change the educational structure. There are a lot of things that need to be reformed and changed in this society, the economic structure, there are all kinds of ways that we could be living in a more humane situation, circumstance, and environment. But I also want to indicate that through the hard work of people like Greg Hicks and the attempt at reform at different points in the society, as much as work needs to be done, the police in the city of Detroit are nowhere as bad as they were when I was a child coming up in this city. It just is not. The whole stress, people, I mean, literally, we were living in a serious, intense military situation with what we felt was no recourse. So I feel encouraged by the fact that there have been change, there has been progress, and there's no reason why it can't be better. And like you say, it's not simply social work, it's a mental health issue, it's an economic issue, and it needs to be addressed accordingly. And I don't know the story of Colin Rose, who was killed in the line of duty. And I don't know how did he deal with the situation? What would have happened if he had a social worker there? Maybe that person could have diffused the situation because, of other kinds of trainings and the way that they approach. So much of what in my conversation with a Black woman police officer, she talks so much about how you approach a situation and having the capacity to do that with some degree of compassion and so forth. So you can escalate a situation or you can de-escalate a situation. And I'm not saying it's that simple, but what I'm saying is it's no different than, I would say, the way that teachers, you can be a teacher who is effective in the classroom because you have the capacity and want to understand a student's point of view, or you can be a teacher who is basically hostile to, your student body, your classroom. And all you want to do is just come in and just talk about what you have to say. And you really don't care about whether or not they are learning, or maybe that they may have something to add or have an input. It's a basic human issue on so many levels in terms of everything that we do.
All right, Melba, we're a bit over. Michael Stouch, I'm going to give you the last word on this issue.
Sure.
And drop the mic when you're done.
Well, I'll just say that we have to contextualize this conversation within the biggest social movement that's happened in this country in 50, 60 years, right? And it's because of that social movement that we're even having this conversation. And also because of that social movement that we're talking about abolition. That was not a word that we ever used to talk about police reform, absent perhaps the slave catching act of the 1850s. That was maybe the last time we had a conversation in this country about this type of about abolition, using explicitly that word. So by saying that, what I'm hoping to do is maintain fidelity to what young people have revealed to us about how this society works for them today, right? And because it's from the experiences of people like Hakeem Littleton, who was killed by the police when he was already on the ground, shot twice, maybe 3 times, disarmed. Someone ran up and shot him in the head after all of that. And it's him and his friends. It's for them that we need to reform the practice of policing.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So there's that going on. And I would also say that that's another way of saying that we should listen to what the movement demands. And what the movement demands is not dare to struggle, dare to win. But that slogan had its place. But the problem with that slogan, in a certain sense, is that it was not critical enough of state power. And it took state power in many ways. And we're living in that aftermath, right? And so that's another thing. That was when we were, I was involved in movements that were never important. Like 20 years ago, I helped organize the thing in Detroit in 2003 against the Iraq War, and we lost, right? And I was involved for another 15 years after that, and I'm still sort of involved today. But what's so crucial to me is to pay attention to what young people are doing and saying, and to try to uplift the young people and their demands. And so we don't have time for it, but I would actually put this question back to the students who are viewing this right now from home. Because really the future of police, I said earlier that the future of policing is the movement to abolish the police. It's actually, the future of policing is actually what young people want it to be, right? And so for all of you young folks who are involved in this stuff, I would encourage you to learn the history of policing and then decide when you're in positions of power, how you want to change it. Because it's up to you.
Mike, I'm sorry to do this, but look, this is not just on young people. Look, man, all elements and ages inside of our society are being shot down, are being over-policed and all this kind of stuff. I don't put this on just young people. I think that we have to have a multi-racial, a multi-generational conversation around questions of power and how that's being deployed. So this is not just to young people in your audience, and putting it back on them. Hell, I can walk out of here and have a police encounter tonight and end up dead. This is everybody, all of us in that.
Well, the problem with intergenerational conversation is when the older generation wants to stifle the insight that young people are trying to struggle to. That's how I see it.
Where has that been demonstrated?
I mean, this is, again, we've reached functionally the end of community policing. All of the conversation that we've had tonight demonstrates how ineffective community policing as a program of reform has been. And so young people are actually proposing a new set of reforms that are around abolition and defunding and all of this kind of stuff. That the program for reform is right there. And I also agree with you. It's not just young people, because you're right. It's been an intergenerational movement and a multiracial movement to a degree that we have not seen again since the abolitionist movement, maybe, right? Like when Michael Reinl, say his name, this Michael Reinl kills a white supremacist and is killed by the federal government, a white man. We have not seen white people willing to do that kind of stuff essentially since John Brown. And that's something that this movement has created. And I would also add, this is year one, arguably. And for those of you that remember, the uprisings of the summers lasted from 1964 until 1968. That's actually, in spite of the math, 5 years. So I don't know what's going to happen, and I'm hesitant to predict as a historian, but we reached a really remarkable moment here, and I'm curious and cautiously optimistic about the future.
Wonderful. I want to thank you all, Michael, Greg, Melba. Thank you all for coming today and for sharing with us. Let me just add to the point, put a button on this by talking about Hakeem Littleton. Hakeem Littleton, basically the excuse that police gave first was that, they got a tip that he had been involved in a shooting before. That wound up being completely untrue, right? And then later they said that, they were picking up his friend who they had ID'd. And his friend, you might notice in the press, was never identified again in the press. Basically, Hakeem Littleton was killed so the DEA could work a snitch for a bigger case, right? And I bring this up by saying that, like, to talk about drugs, right? One way you could stop a lot of these arrests and the harassment and the brutality, right? And another way that we could, stop criminalizing Black people and not looking at the distributors and the dealers is by making all of these drugs legal, right? You wouldn't have turf battles. You wouldn't have things of this nature.
Yes. Sorry.
Oh, go. You chiming in? So I just wanted to kind of point that out, because sometimes we get mixed up. We think about all the calamities that kind of like come on the backs of like the drug trade, and the drug trade basically replaced, industry in this town, where people had opportunities to kind of make a living with, and conversely at that time, the economy shifted. So yeah, you could get a job at Burger King, but yeah, who wants to fucking bust their ass for 40 hours a week at Burger King when you could sell dope? And I say this not as an academic, but as somebody who made that choice, right? I wasn't poor per se, but I made that choice, right? Because I didn't have a lot of good options, and I saw that as my best option. So if you want to prevent somebody from me like dealing drugs in the future, make that shit legal, right? And then corresponding to that, right, is this question of defunding. Then if there's no longer these drug dealers, not even distributors, dealers, small-time dealers to chase, then what do you need this budget for, right? So I do want to applaud all of you for all the work that you've done and are doing. And I will say to Michael's point about abolish, right? The right has a really good trick, right? They move the goalposts all the time. And the left has to move the goalposts. So while people might be uncomfortable with this term abolition or abolish, right? I think it's an important way to get people to think more expansively about what is possible, because another world is possible. And I think we'll end there. Thank you. Oh, lastly, Carolyn is making me say the film Dare to Struggle, Dare to Win, based on what Greg said before, I think hasn't been formally released, but we'll definitely kind of get out to you information about how you could secure that film once it is. Again, thanks everybody for coming. Same bat time, same bat channel, Wednesday, 6 to 8 p.m. Thank you all. Oh, you guys stay on, please, for 1 sec. The presenters. Okay. Michael, I got to ask you, what do you mean by